December 26, 1996. For 28 years, one question haunted the JonBenet Ramsey investigation. Not who killed her, not what happened that night, but a seemingly simple question that John Ramsey steadfastly, consistently, and absolutely refused to answer. Journalists asked it, investigators demanded it, documentary filmmakers pressed him on it, and every single time, John would deflect, change the subject, or simply end the interview. His silence on this one specific question fed decades of speculation, conspiracy theories, and public suspicion. What was he hiding? What had he done during those crucial hours that he couldn't bring himself to discuss? Why would an innocent man refuse to answer such a straightforward question about his whereabouts on the morning his daughter went missing? For 28 years, the refusal itself became almost as famous as the case. But recently, at 80 years old, John Ramsey finally broke his silence. He answered the question. And what he revealed changes how we understand not just this case, but the immense human cost of living under decades of suspicion. John Ramsey breaks. Silence, the one question he refused to answer for 28 years. This is the story of the question that haunted an investigation, the silence that fed conspiracy, and the deeply personal reason why a father chose to remain silent rather than satisfy public curiosity. This is about what happens when grief collides with suspicion, when private moments become evidence, and when the world demands answers to questions that feel too painful to address. But this is also about something bigger, about how investigations shaped by media pressure and public opinion can go catastrophically wrong, about how the focus on one family allowed another perpetrator to remain free for nearly 3 decades, about the DNA evidence that changed everything, the investigators who dared to look elsewhere, and the technology that may finally bring justice to a 6-year-old girl who deserved far better than what the system gave her. Before we examine what John finally revealed, if you're interested in cases where silence tells its own story, where unanswered questions shape investigations, and where the human cost of suspicion extends far beyond the crime itself, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. Because here at Crime Uncovered, we examine not just the mysteries, but the people at the center of them, the choices they make under unimaginable pressure, and what those choices reveal about truth, grief, and human nature. Subscribe now, because some answers are worth waiting 28 years to hear. JonBenet Patricia Ramsey was 6 years old when she died in her Boulder, Colorado home on December 26, 1996. She was a bright, energetic child who loved performing and participating in beauty pageants. Her father, JonBenet Ramsey, was a highly successful businessman who had founded Access Graphics, a computer services company that had grown into a billion-dollar subsidiary of Lockheed Martin. Her mother, Patsy Ramsey, was a former Miss West Virginia who devoted herself to raising JonBenet and her older brother Burke, who was 9 years old. The family lived in a large Tudor-style home in one of Boulder's most affluent neighborhoods. To outsiders, they appeared to be living an ideal American life, successful and happy, with no indication that tragedy was about to destroy everything they had built. JonBenet Ramsey was born in Lincoln, Nebraska in 1943. He was the kind of man who had built his life through determination and hard work. After serving in the United States Navy as a Civil Engineer Corps officer, he pursued education at Michigan State University, earning a bachelor's degree in electrical engineering followed by an MBA. He entered the corporate world with clear ambition, working his way through various positions before founding Access Graphics in 1989. Under his leadership, the company grew exponentially, eventually becoming one of the most successful technology distribution companies in the country. By 1996, John was at the peak of his career, respected in Boulder's business community, well-connected socially, and financially comfortable beyond what most Americans could imagine. He had been married before, and his first marriage had produced 3 children, Elizabeth, Melinda, and John Andrew. The dissolution of that marriage and the tragic death of his daughter Elizabeth in a car accident in 1992 added layers of grief and complexity to John's life that few people understood. He rarely spoke publicly about Elizabeth's death, keeping that particular wound private in a way that would mirror how he later handled other painful memories. The pattern of silence in the face of grief was not new to John Ramsey. It was something he had practiced before, something that had become deeply embedded in how he coped with loss, and it would define how he handled the most devastating loss of his life. Patsy Ramsey, born Patricia Ann Paugh in West Virginia, was a woman who carried beauty and tragedy in equal measure. She had been crowned Miss West Virginia in 1977, a title that represented everything she valued about presentation, poise, and public image. She graduated from West Virginia University with a degree in journalism and worked briefly in the field before marrying John in 1980. Together they had Burke and then JonBenet. Patsy devoted herself to motherhood with the same intensity she brought to everything else in her life. She entered JonBenet in beauty pageants, organized family events, maintained the household, and presented an image of domestic perfection to the world around them. But beneath that polished surface, Patsy had already faced her own brush with mortality. In 1993, she was diagnosed with stage 4 ovarian cancer. The diagnosis was devastating, and the treatment was brutal. But Patsy fought, underwent aggressive surgery and chemotherapy, and beat the odds. She went into remission. She recovered. She was alive when other patients with similar diagnoses were not. This experience of surviving death gave Patsy a perspective that many people never acquire, an understanding of how fragile life truly is. And it makes what happened to her family in December 1996 all the more devastating, because she had already looked death in the face once and won. The second time, the universe would not be as kind. The Ramsey family home at 755 15th Street in Boulder was a testament to their success and lifestyle. The Tudor-style mansion contained 15 rooms spread across 3 floors plus a basement, totaling nearly 7,000 square feet. It was filled with expensive furnishings, artwork, and comfortable living spaces. The neighborhood, University Hill, was one of Boulder's most prestigious areas, home to professors, business executives, and other successful professionals. The Ramseys had moved to Boulder from Atlanta in 1991, when John's business required relocation. They integrated into the community, joining social organizations, attending church regularly at St. John's Episcopal, making friends among Boulder's elite. They were known as generous donors and active community members. To their neighbors and friends, they seemed like everything a successful American family should be. There was nothing about their public presentation that suggested anything other than happiness, stability, and comfort. The layout of the house itself would become critical to understanding what happened. The main floor contained the living areas, kitchen, and dining room. A spiral staircase connected the first floor to the second floor, where the master bedroom and children's bedrooms were located. The basement was divided into multiple rooms, including a boiler room, storage areas, and a small wine cellar at the far end. This wine cellar was a room the family rarely used, a small windowless space that stored bottles of wine and not much else. The complexity of the house, with its multiple rooms, levels, and spaces, meant that someone could move through it without being easily tracked. This architectural reality would become significant in theories about what happened that night and in the questions about John's movements during those crucial morning hours. The house was large enough that even members of the family could spend extended periods in different areas without being aware of exactly where others were at any given moment. That fact would become central to debates about what was known and when. Christmas Day 1996 was spent in ways that many families would recognize. The morning began with presents, the children excited about new toys and gifts. JonBenet received a bicycle she had wanted, along with dolls and other toys. Burke received video games and building sets that kept him occupied throughout the day. That evening, the family attended a Christmas party at the home of Fleet and Priscilla White, close friends who were also prominent Boulder residents. The party was relaxed, with children playing together while adults socialized. Witnesses would later say the Ramseys seemed normal, happy, engaged. JonBenet played with other children at the gathering. Burke spent time with friends. John and Patsy mingled with other adults, discussing everyday topics and holiday plans. There was absolutely nothing about their behavior that evening that suggested anything was wrong, that anyone was stressed or angry or hiding something. They left around 9:30 in the evening, driving the short distance home. Among the foods available at the White Party was fresh pineapple. This detail, seemingly insignificant at the time, would later become one of the most analyzed pieces of evidence in the case. Fresh pineapple was served buffet-style alongside other holiday foods. Whether JonBenet ate pineapple at the party or whether she consumed it later at home would become a question that exposed one of the most significant contradictions in the family's account of the evening. Forensic analysis of JonBenet's digestive system would later reveal evidence of pineapple consumption approximately 1 to 2 hours before her death. This finding was important because it suggested JonBenet had been awake and eating after her parents claimed to have put her to bed. The pineapple question became a point of contention between those who believed the family's account of events and those who questioned it. But on Christmas night, nobody at the party thought twice about the fruit on the table. According to their later statements, the Ramseys put the children to bed relatively quickly after arriving home. John carried JonBenet upstairs, placing her in bed because she was tired. Patsy helped with pajamas. Burke went to his room. John and Patsy completed last-minute packing for a trip planned for the next day, flying to their vacation home in Charlevoix, Michigan, where they would celebrate a second Christmas with John's older children. They went to bed around 10, expecting to wake early for their flight. It was an ordinary end to an ordinary Christmas. But sometime during the night that followed, something unspeakable happened in that house, and the timeline of what happened, when it happened, and who knew about it, would become the central mystery that has haunted this case for nearly 3 decades. At approximately 5:52 on the morning of December 26, 1996, Patsy Ramsey made a call to emergency services that would become one of the most analyzed recordings in criminal history. Her voice sounded panicked, hysterical, genuinely terrified. The recording has been examined by voice stress analysts, law enforcement experts, linguistics specialists, and countless others, all trying to determine whether her emotion was genuine or performed. She told the dispatcher she had come downstairs to make coffee and found a ransom note on the staircase. The note said JonBenet had been kidnapped and was being held for ransom. Patsy said she ran upstairs to JonBenet's room and found her bed empty. She screamed for John. They checked Burke's room and found him sleeping. The dispatcher tried to calm Patsy, asking questions about the note and whether there were signs of forced entry. Patsy struggled to answer coherently, her voice breaking. At the end of the recorded call, just before the phone disconnects, there is a brief moment where the phone is not fully hung up. In that moment, background voices can be heard. The recording is muffled and unclear, but it exists. Audio forensic experts were brought in to enhance and analyze this background portion. Multiple experts, using different enhancement techniques, reached similar conclusions. They could identify 3 distinct voices: an adult female consistent with Patsy, an adult male consistent with John, and a higher-pitched voice consistent with a young male child. The exact words remain disputed, with different analysts hearing different things. But the fundamental conclusion of several experts was that a child's voice, consistent with Burke's age, could be heard in the background. This suggested Burke was not asleep in his bedroom as his parents had stated. He was awake. He was present. He was aware something was happening, and his parents had misrepresented this fact to police from the very beginning. This single observation, buried in audio analysis that most people never heard, opened questions about the family's account that would not be addressed for years. The ransom note itself became one of the most controversial pieces of evidence in the case. It was written on paper from inside the house, using a pen from inside the house. The note was nearly 3 pages long, extraordinarily unusual for a ransom demand. Real kidnappers typically communicate demands quickly and clearly, not compose lengthy multi-page letters. The language was strange and inconsistent, mixing formal phrases with casual conversational language, including what seemed to be references to movie dialogue. It demanded exactly $118,000, a curiously specific amount that happened to match the bonus John had received from his company that year, a figure that would not be public knowledge but that someone inside the household would certainly know. The note warned not to contact police, to wait for a phone call between 8 and 10 in the morning with further instructions. It threatened consequences if instructions were not followed. It was signed with an acronym that has never been definitively explained despite decades of speculation. A practice version of the note had been started on the same pad of paper and then abandoned, suggesting the writer had composed in the house and had made a first attempt before writing the final version. This detail alone suggested someone who felt comfortable taking time, who felt safe sitting in the house and writing and revising. Handwriting experts reached wildly different conclusions about who wrote it. Some could not eliminate Patsy as the author. Others said definitively she did not write it. John's handwriting was generally eliminated. The note remains one of the most debated pieces of evidence in the entire case, with every word, every phrase, every letter formation scrutinized for clues about who wrote it and why. And it remains to this day one of the most unusual ransom notes ever examined by law enforcement anywhere in the country. When Boulder police officers arrived at approximately 6 in the morning, they were walking into what should have been treated as a potential crime scene requiring strict protocols. Instead, what followed was a cascade of errors that would compromise the investigation from its very beginning. The first officers conducted a search of the house, including checking the basement. One officer attempted to open the door to the wine cellar but found the latch difficult and moved on. This failure to thoroughly search would prove catastrophic. Instead of securing the house as a crime scene, police allowed the Ramseys to call friends and family. Within an hour, multiple people arrived. A reverend from their church, Fleet and Priscilla White, John Fernie and his wife, victim advocates, multiple officers, all moving through the house using bathrooms, touching surfaces, potentially affecting evidence without realizing it. The house should have been immediately secured with only forensic personnel allowed inside. Instead, it became a gathering place, a failure of basic protocol that would permanently compromise the ability to properly analyze evidence from the scene. The ransom note had specified a phone call would come between 8 and 10 in the morning. John had arranged to get the money despite banks being closed. Everyone waited tensely. 8 o'clock came and went. 9 o'clock passed. As 10 approached and passed with no call, the tension became unbearable. If JonBenet had really been kidnapped for ransom, why weren't the kidnappers calling? What did the silence mean? For John Ramsey, this was the moment when the story of a kidnapping began to fall apart. The fear that had been present all morning began to transform into something far more devastating. The possibility that something had gone deeply wrong, that JonBenet might not be coming home. The minutes ticked by. 11 o'clock, noon. Each passing hour making the scenario described in that ransom note seem less and less plausible. And for everyone gathered in that house, the weight of that realization was becoming impossible to ignore. At approximately 1 in the afternoon, nearly 7 hours after police first arrived, Detective Linda Arndt made a decision with enormous consequences. She suggested that John Ramsey and Fleet White conduct another search of the house to see if anything had been missed. John and Fleet started in the basement, checking various rooms and storage areas. Then John opened the door to the wine cellar. He turned on the light. There, covered with a white blanket he recognized as one from JonBenet's bedroom, was his daughter. He let out a scream of anguish that everyone in the house could hear. He rushed in, pulled the blanket away, and saw JonBenet. John picked her up and carried her upstairs, an understandable reaction, but one that would compromise the scene. Evidence in the immediate area was affected by his instinctive need to get his daughter out of that room. Detective Arndt tried to take control, asking John to set JonBenet down so the scene could be properly documented, but the damage was already done. JonBenet had been moved from her original position. The blanket that had covered her had been disturbed. The crime scene had been irreversibly altered by the actions of those first critical moments. The medical examination revealed JonBenet had suffered severe head trauma and had been strangled using a ligature device. Investigators determined the device had been assembled using items found inside the home. The medical examiner determined she had died from asphyxiation associated with the head injury. The estimated time of death was between 10 at night on December 25th and 2 in the morning on December 26th, meaning she had likely been deceased for hours before Patsy found the ransom note and called emergency services. The examination also revealed additional evidence that remained deeply disputed, with qualified experts reaching different conclusions based on the same findings. Due to the sensitive nature of this case involving a minor, specific details of these findings remain in sealed court documents. What can be stated is that this evidence became a significant factor in the investigation and in the theories that emerged over the following decades. This question of interpretation has been debated for 28 years without resolution, and its implications for understanding the full scope of what happened that night remain significant to this day. The Boulder Police Department made decisions in those early days that would shape everything that followed. Within days, investigators had developed a theory. Someone in the Ramsey family had harmed JonBenet, and the ransom note was an elaborate staging designed to misdirect the investigation. The lack of clear forced entry, the fact that the note was written on materials from inside the house, the unusual nature and length of the note itself, all contributed to this theory. Investigators became focused on the family, particularly on Patsy as a primary suspect. They theorized that Patsy might have harmed JonBenet in a moment of anger, and that John had discovered what happened and helped stage the kidnapping scene to protect his wife and family. Other theories suggested that Burke might have been involved, possibly striking JonBenet in an accident or altercation, with the parents staging a cover-up to protect their son. But here is what is critical to understand about how this investigation developed. The Boulder Police Department was, by any measure, unprepared for a case of this magnitude. Boulder was and remains a relatively small, affluent college town with low violent crime rates. The department had approximately 150 officers serving a population of around 90,000. Serious violent crimes, particularly crimes against children, were extremely rare. Many officers had never investigated a homicide. The department had no dedicated homicide unit, no specialists in child crimes, and very limited experience with major crime scene processing. They were walking into one of the most complex and high-profile cases in American history, with experience that was fundamentally inadequate for the task. This inexperience manifested in the very first hours. Officer French's failure to thoroughly search the wine cellar, the decision to allow friends and family into what should have been a sealed crime scene, the failure to immediately separate and interview family members individually before they had time to coordinate their stories. These were not malicious decisions. They were the decisions of officers who had never faced anything like this situation and who didn't fully grasp the significance of what they were doing or failing to do in those first critical hours. But the consequences of these decisions were permanent. Evidence was compromised. The crime scene was contaminated. Opportunities that existed only in those first hours were lost forever. And the foundation upon which the entire investigation would be built was already cracked before it had even truly begun. The case against the Ramseys in public opinion was swift and devastating. Media coverage was relentless and sensationalistic, often going far beyond what the actual evidence supported. The fact that JonBenet had competed in beauty pageants led to widespread circulation of photographs showing her in makeup and costumes. These images, which her parents had proudly taken as memories of their daughter's participation in an activity she loved, were now used to suggest the Ramseys had been exploiting their child, creating an image that was inappropriate and potentially dangerous. Television shows ran endless specials analyzing every aspect of the family's life. Body language experts appeared on news programs declaring John seemed too controlled to be an innocent, grieving father. Psychologists analyzed Patsy and declared her behavior indicated guilt rather than genuine grief. The fact that the Ramseys hired attorneys was cited as evidence of guilt rather than a prudent legal response. Every interview, every photograph, every public appearance was dissected and interpreted through the lens of suspected guilt. The media created a narrative so powerful, so pervasive, that it became almost impossible to separate what was actually proven from what was simply believed. And once that narrative took hold in public consciousness, it proved extraordinarily difficult to dislodge, even when evidence would later suggest it was fundamentally wrong. The Boulder Police Department and the District Attorney's Office developed a deeply dysfunctional relationship over the handling of the case. Police, convinced of family guilt, wanted to aggressively pursue charges. District Attorney Alex Hunter believed the evidence was entirely circumstantial, that there was no physical evidence directly linking any family member to the crime, that bringing charges they couldn't prove would be unjust and would prevent the case from ever being properly solved. This conflict became so severe it actively harmed the investigation. Evidence wasn't shared properly between offices. Strategic decisions were made without consultation. The institutional dysfunction meant that even when evidence should have prompted a change in investigative direction, organizational conflict prevented that change from happening effectively. The media covered the conflict extensively, creating the impression of a completely dysfunctional investigation, where turf battles and ego were taking precedence over finding a 6-year-old's killer. In October 1999, a grand jury was convened to hear evidence and determine whether charges should be filed. The proceedings stretched over more than a year. When complete, District Attorney Hunter announced no charges would be filed, stating the evidence was insufficient. For years, this was the accepted narrative. But in 2013, sealed documents revealed a shocking truth. The grand jury had actually voted to indict both John and Patsy Ramsey on charges of child abuse resulting in death and being accessory to a crime. However, Alex Hunter had refused to sign the indictment, essentially overruling the jury's decision. He explained he didn't believe he could prove the charges beyond reasonable doubt at trial, that the evidence was too ambiguous. The revelation caused controversy, with many feeling vindicated in their belief of the Ramseys' guilt. But what most people failed to consider was that this grand jury process had taken place before the most important forensic evidence in the case had been fully analyzed and understood. But what the public didn't fully grasp was that this grand jury process occurred before the most significant forensic evidence in the case was properly analyzed, because there was evidence present from the very first forensic examination that told a completely different story from the one investigators were pursuing. Evidence that the Boulder Police Department had been dismissing, minimizing, and explaining away for years. Evidence that would eventually force an official change in the direction of the investigation, and evidence that raises the most uncomfortable question about this entire case. What if the Boulder Police had been wrong from the very beginning? The forensic examination of JonBenet, performed on December 27, 1996, included standard collection procedures that captured biological material from multiple locations. Samples taken from underneath JonBenet's fingernails revealed the presence of genetic material that did not belong to her. Laboratory analysis identified this material as male DNA. When this profile was compared to DNA samples from John Ramsey, Burke Ramsey, and other male family members and friends who had been in the house, there was no match. The DNA belonged to an unknown male who had never been identified or connected to the family. This was the first indication, present from day one of the forensic investigation, that someone outside the Ramsey family had been in physical contact with JonBenet. Additionally, analysis of JonBenet's underwear revealed the presence of male DNA mixed with blood, the same unknown male profile found under her fingernails. This DNA was not simply present on the surface of the fabric where manufacturing contamination might be expected. It was mixed with blood in areas directly related to injuries documented during the examination. The presence of male DNA in these specific locations strongly suggested it had been deposited during or immediately around the time of the crime. This evidence should have been treated as the most critical lead in the case. It should have immediately shifted the investigation away from the family and toward identifying this unknown individual. But the Boulder Police dismissed it. They suggested it could be manufacturing contamination. They suggested innocent transfer. They explained it away because it contradicted the theory they had already committed to pursuing. This dismissal of the DNA evidence represents what many investigators and legal experts would later identify as the single most significant failure in the entire case. The evidence was there. It was scientific. It was objective. It pointed away from the family and toward an unknown perpetrator. And for over a decade, it was ignored because it didn't fit the narrative the investigation had built. The consequences of this decision would define the case for generations. Throughout these decades of suspicion, public accusation, and relentless media scrutiny, John and Patsy Ramsey maintained their complete innocence. They gave numerous interviews, always stating the same things. They did not kill their daughter. They did not know who did. They wanted the killer found and brought to justice. They submitted to police interviews with attorneys present, which police cited as evidence of guilt, but which the Ramseys explained as necessary protection given they were being treated as suspects rather than grieving parents. They took polygraph tests administered by experts they hired, and according to those experts passed, though police dismissed these results as unreliable since the Ramseys controlled who administered them. They provided handwriting samples, submitted to searches, turned over financial records. The stress and trauma took an enormous toll on the entire family. They moved away from Boulder in 1997, unable to continue living in the city where their daughter had been murdered and where they felt persecuted. For Patsy Ramsey, the years following JonBenet's death were marked by grief, anger at accusations, determination to clear their name, and ultimately illness. She had survived ovarian cancer in 1993 after aggressive treatment, but the stress of JonBenet's case took a devastating toll. In 2002, the cancer returned. Patsy fought it for 4 more years, undergoing additional rounds of treatment. But on June 24, 2006, Patsy Ramsey died at age 49. She died never seeing her daughter's killer caught, never having the accusations against her definitively disproven, never receiving public acknowledgement from the Boulder Police Department that they had been wrong. Even in death, Patsy Ramsey could not escape the suspicion that had haunted her for a decade. Her passing was mourned by those who believed in her innocence. Others cynically suggested her death was convenient, preventing her from ever facing charges if new evidence emerged. The cruelty of that interpretation speaks volumes about how thoroughly the media narrative had poisoned public perception of this family. 2 years later, when the DNA evidence would officially exonerate her, Patsy was no longer alive to hear it. The vindication that science would eventually provide came too late for the woman who had fought cancer twice and accusations her entire adult life. John Ramsey remarried in 2011, 5 years after Patsy's death. He has continued living relatively quietly, but periodically giving interviews when significant developments occur or when he feels compelled to speak out. He has been a consistent advocate for reinvestigating the case using modern technology unavailable in 1996. He has criticized Boulder Police repeatedly for what he characterizes as decades of mishandling, tunnel vision focus on the family, and resistance to using new DNA testing methods. At 80 years old, John is acutely aware time is running out to see justice for his daughter. Burke Ramsey has lived his entire adult life under the shadow of his sister's unsolved case. He was 9 when JonBenet died, a child who lost his sister and then watched his parents be accused of murdering her. Some theories suggested Burke accidentally harmed JonBenet and that parents covered it up. Burke has vehemently denied involvement. In 2016, he gave a rare interview on Dr. Phil, his first major public appearance in years, to defend himself and his family. During that interview, Burke made an admission that confirmed something audio experts had been claiming for years. He admitted he was actually awake on the morning of December 26th. He said he heard his mother's distress and was aware something was happening. He described staying in his room, pretending to be asleep. This admission contradicted what his parents had told police for 2 decades, why they initially said Burke was asleep, what they were protecting him from, and what Burke actually heard or saw during those morning hours remain questions that have never been fully answered. That same year, a CBS documentary presented a theory suggesting Burke might have been involved in JonBenet's death. Burke sued CBS for defamation, arguing the documentary falsely accused him without real evidence. The lawsuit was eventually settled with undisclosed terms reportedly in the range of millions of dollars. Combined with the DNA exoneration from 2008, Burke had both scientific evidence and legal vindication establishing his innocence. But the damage to his reputation and his childhood had already been done. No settlement can undo the years of public scrutiny a child should never have had to endure. Throughout these 28 years, there has been one question that John Ramsey consistently, firmly, and completely refused to answer in detail. The question seemed simple. What exactly did you do during the morning of December 26th? Specifically during the hours between 10 in the morning and 1 in the afternoon, when Detective Linda Arndt testified she lost track of your whereabouts. It's a reasonable question. John was in the house during those crucial hours while everyone waited for the ransom call. He was moving around, not staying constantly monitored. Detective Arndt's testimony that she didn't know where John was at all times opened a window for theories about what he might have been doing during those unaccounted hours. Was he somewhere in the house connected to evidence? Was he staging something? Or was he simply dealing with crisis in his own way? John would describe the general morning when asked. He would talk about calling friends, waiting for the call, arranging the money. He would describe the growing fear when the call didn't come. He would talk about discovering JonBenet, the anguish of that moment. But when pressed for specific details about what exactly he was doing during those hours, where specifically he was at different times, John would become vague. He would say he couldn't remember clearly because of trauma. He would say his lawyers advised him not to discuss specific details. Sometimes he would simply decline, saying it was too painful. This refusal fed speculation for nearly 3 decades. The theories ranged from sinister to mundane. Those convinced of guilt believed he was hiding something criminal. Perhaps he had been tampering with evidence, removing or altering things that might point to involvement. Perhaps he had been coordinating his story with Patsy. The fact that Arndt couldn't account for his whereabouts seemed to provide opportunity for activity without observation. Those who believed in innocence offered other explanations. Perhaps he was simply coping with stress through movement. Perhaps he was in areas connected to JonBenet, trying to feel close to her. Perhaps his inability to remember was genuine trauma-induced confusion. But there was one explanation very few people considered, one possibility that seemed too simple and too personal to be the real reason for decades of silence. And yet, according to John's recent revelation, this simple explanation is the truth. In a new interview conducted as part of a recent documentary, John Ramsey, now 80 years old, and apparently feeling he has nothing left to protect after decades of accusations, finally answered the question he had refused to address for 28 years. He explained what he was doing during those hours and why he had been so unwilling to discuss it publicly. The answer is not what anyone expected. According to John, during that horrible morning, while everyone waited for a ransom call that never came, while police and friends milled around downstairs, while Patsy sat in shock surrounded by people trying to comfort her, John did something he has never been able to discuss without overwhelming emotion. At some point during those agonizing hours, he went upstairs to JonBenet's bedroom. He closed the door behind him. He sat on her bed surrounded by her stuffed animals and dolls and toys. He looked at drawings she had made displayed on her walls. He opened her closet and touched her clothes hanging there. He lay down on her bed, his head on her pillow where her head would have been just hours before. He could smell her shampoo on the pillow, that distinctive scent of childhood that every parent knows and cherishes. He picked up her favorite stuffed animal and held it close. And he wept. He cried harder than he had ever cried in his life, alone in his daughter's room, surrounded by remnants of her short life, believing she had been kidnapped and not knowing if he would ever see her alive again. For John Ramsey, a man raised in a generation where men were taught not to show emotion, where crying was seen as weakness, where maintaining composure was considered essential to masculinity, this moment of complete emotional breakdown was intensely private and personal. He had gone to JonBenet's room because he needed to be close to her, needed to feel connected to her somehow, needed to be in a space that was hers. The grief and terror he felt was overwhelming, a father's worst nightmare manifesting in real time. He had no idea JonBenet was already deceased, lying in the wine cellar just one floor below where he sat crying on her bed. He believed she was being held somewhere by kidnappers, probably terrified, possibly hurt, waiting for her father to save her. And he felt completely helpless, unable to protect his daughter, unable to do anything except wait for a phone call that wasn't coming. The anguish of those moments, the feeling of absolute helplessness and grief and terror, was something John could not bring himself to discuss publicly. Not with police interrogating him as a suspect, not with media portraying him as a cold, calculating killer, not with the world watching and judging every word and gesture. So when asked about those specific hours, John would deflect. He would say he couldn't remember. He would change the subject, anything to avoid having to describe those intensely private moments of grief in his daughter's bedroom. According to John's explanation, he refused to discuss these details for 28 years because he knew exactly how they would be interpreted by those who believed he was guilty. If he admitted spending time alone in JonBenet's bedroom during that morning, investigators and armchair detectives would say he was tampering with evidence. If he described lying on her bed and crying, body language experts would appear on television to analyze whether his tears were genuine or performed. Every detail of those private moments would be dissected, questioned, interpreted as evidence of guilt rather than as a father's anguish. The stuffed animal he held would be examined for his DNA or fibers. The pillow would be scrutinized for transfer evidence. His presence in that room would be characterized not as a grieving father seeking connection with his missing daughter, but as a guilty man staging a scene. So John chose silence. He chose to protect that private moment of grief, to keep it sacred and personal, even knowing his refusal to explain would feed suspicion and conspiracy theories for decades. The cost of that silence was enormous. It gave ammunition to everyone who believed he was hiding something. It fed the narrative of a calculating man with something to hide. It became, in many ways, one of the most damaging aspects of the entire case for his reputation. But John chose it deliberately, knowingly, because the alternative, exposing his most vulnerable, most painful moment to public scrutiny and cynical interpretation, was something he simply could not face. Now, at 80 years old, having lived nearly 3 decades under suspicion, having lost Patsy to cancer while she was still viewed by many as guilty, having watched Burke endure accusations and litigation, having spent 28 years defending innocence against an investigation and media that seemed determined to prove guilt, John says he simply doesn't care anymore what people think. He wanted to tell the truth about those hours, not because it changes anything about the investigation or proves his innocence, but because he's tired of the speculation and wants people to understand that sometimes silence isn't about hiding guilt, but about protecting something precious. A father's grief, a private moment of connection with a child who was already gone, but who he desperately hoped was still alive. A memory that is painful enough without being subjected to public analysis and cynical interpretation. John says he knows there will be people who don't believe this explanation, who will say it's too convenient, too calculated. But for those willing to consider the possibility John is telling the truth, This revelation offers a window into the human cost of being at the center of such a notorious case. But John's revelation, as deeply personal as it is, also raises larger questions about the investigation itself. Questions about why the Boulder Police focused so intensely on the family when scientific evidence pointed elsewhere. Questions about what might have happened if that evidence had been properly prioritized from the beginning. Questions about whether the tunnel vision that defined this investigation allowed the real perpetrator to remain free for nearly 3 decades while an innocent family was destroyed. The DNA evidence that eventually changed the direction of the case had been present since the very first forensic examination. Male DNA, unknown, unidentified, found under JonBenet's fingernails and on her clothing in contexts suggesting direct involvement in the crime. For over a decade, this evidence was dismissed, minimized, and explained away. Investigators suggested manufacturing contamination. They suggested innocent transfer. They offered explanation after explanation for why this DNA shouldn't change their focus on the family. But the science was clear. The DNA was real. It belonged to someone who had been in physical contact with JonBenet in circumstances consistent with the crime, and it excluded every member of the Ramsey family. In 2003, when Mary Lacey became the district attorney for Boulder County, she brought fresh perspective to the case. Unlike her predecessors, Lacey was willing to follow the evidence wherever it led, even when it contradicted the theory that had dominated the investigation for 7 years. She authorized new DNA testing using advanced touch DNA techniques that could extract genetic material from smaller samples than previously possible. Items of JonBenet's clothing were sent to the Boulder Technology Group, a private forensic laboratory specializing in DNA analysis. The results were extraordinary. In multiple separate locations on JonBenet's long johns, the laboratory identified the same male DNA profile that had been found on the underwear in 1997, the same unknown male profile, present on 2 different items of clothing, in multiple locations. This eliminated the manufacturing contamination theory entirely. It eliminated innocent transfer. It proved sustained or repeated physical contact between JonBenet and this unknown male. The evidence was scientifically conclusive in ways that previous testing had not been. On July 9, 2008, based on this DNA evidence, District Attorney Mary Lacey sent a formal letter to John Ramsey, officially exonerating the entire Ramsey family. The letter stated clearly that the DNA evidence had convinced her office that an unknown male had been responsible, and that the Ramseys should be completely eliminated from suspicion. She wrote that there was no innocent explanation for the presence of the unknown male DNA on JonBenet's clothing. She apologized to the family for the way they had been treated. She stated explicitly that the investigation should now focus on identifying the unknown person whose DNA had been found. This exoneration was based purely on science, not on opinion, not on legal maneuvering. On DNA evidence, the most reliable form of forensic identification available. For John Ramsey, the exoneration brought official vindication after 12 years of living under suspicion, but it also brought painful acknowledgement of what the investigation had cost. His family had been destroyed by accusations the science had already disproven. His wife had died under suspicion 2 years before being officially cleared. His son had lived his entire adolescence and young adulthood under a cloud of public accusation. And the real perpetrator, the unknown male whose DNA was found on JonBenet, had been allowed to remain unidentified for over a decade because investigators chose to focus on the wrong people. The unknown male whose DNA cleared the family has never been identified. Despite the profile being entered into criminal databases and searched against millions of other profiles, no match has ever been found. This person either has never been arrested for a crime requiring DNA collection, or they have successfully avoided detection entirely. But in recent years, advances in genetic genealogy have offered unprecedented hope for finally identifying unknown DNA profiles in cold cases. This technique uses DNA from crime scenes and compares it to profiles in public genealogy databases where millions of people have uploaded their genetic information for ancestry research. By identifying distant relatives through shared DNA segments, investigators can build family trees and narrow down potential suspects. This method has been remarkably successful in solving cases that seemed permanently beyond reach. The Golden State Killer case demonstrated its power most dramatically when Joseph James DeAngelo was identified in 2018 after evading capture for over 40 years. Law enforcement used public genealogy databases to trace the crime scene DNA to distant relatives, then built a detailed family tree that eventually led directly to D'Angelo. Dozens of other cold cases across the country have since been solved using the same approach, proving that genetic genealogy is not experimental, but proven, reliable, and capable of identifying individuals from DNA samples decades old. The unknown male DNA in the JonBenet Ramsey case is an ideal candidate for this technique. The profile is complete, the DNA is well preserved, and the method has proven effective in similar situations. John Ramsey has been a vocal advocate for applying genetic genealogy to his daughter's case. He has met repeatedly with Boulder Police, urged them to pursue this avenue, offered to fund private testing. He believes, based on the success of this technique in other cases, that his daughter's killer can be identified if the proper resources and commitment are brought to bear. But as of late 2024 and into 2025, Boulder Police have been slow to fully embrace this approach. They have stated they are exploring the possibility, working with experts, evaluating options, but concrete progress has been limited. This hesitancy, after nearly 3 decades of investigation, after official exoneration based on DNA, after advances in technology that could potentially solve the case, raises uncomfortable questions about institutional resistance. Is the Boulder Police Department genuinely committed to solving JonBenet Ramsey's case? Or has decades of commitment to one theory made it difficult to fully accept that the answer lies in a completely different direction? The story of the JonBenet Ramsey case is ultimately a story about multiple failures. The failure of the initial investigation to properly secure and process the crime scene. The failure to give proper weight to DNA evidence that contradicted the preferred theory. The failure of media to distinguish between evidence and speculation. The failure of public opinion to resist conviction without charge. The failure of institutional processes to self-correct when evidence demanded it. And the ongoing failure to pursue the most promising lead in the case with the urgency and commitment it deserves. Behind all of these institutional failures are real human beings who paid enormous prices. JonBenet herself, a 6-year-old girl who deserved justice and whose killer remains free. Patsy Ramsey, who died under suspicion for a crime she did not commit. Burke Ramsey, who lost his childhood to accusations he should never have had to face. And John Ramsey, who spent 28 years carrying the weight of a question he couldn't answer publicly, without exposing the most painful moment of his life to public judgment. John's revelation about those hours in JonBenet's bedroom doesn't solve the case. It doesn't identify the unknown male whose DNA cleared the family. It doesn't change the forensic evidence or the investigative record. What it does is remind us that behind every piece of evidence, every timeline, every theory, there are human beings living with consequences that extend far beyond what any investigation can capture. A father's grief in his daughter's empty room. A mother's fight against cancer while fighting against accusations. A boy growing up in the shadow of tragedy. These are the realities that exist alongside the forensic science and the investigative failures. They are the human cost of a case that has consumed 30 years of American attention and generated more theories, more debate, and more public judgment than almost any other crime in modern history. The case of JonBenet Ramsey may finally be approaching resolution. The DNA evidence exists. The technology to identify the unknown male exists. The public genealogy databases exist. Everything needed to potentially solve this case is in place. What remains is the will and the commitment to follow the evidence to its conclusion, regardless of what that conclusion reveals about decades of investigative failure and institutional stubbornness. John Ramsey, at 80 years old, says he will continue pushing for that resolution as long as he is alive. For JonBenet, for the truth, for the justice that a 6-year-old girl deserved 30 years ago and has never received. Whether John Ramsey is guilty or innocent, whether his explanation for those missing hours is truth or another carefully crafted account, his decision to finally break silence reminds us that behind every high-profile criminal case are real human beings experiencing real trauma, grief, and pain that extends far beyond the public spectacle the case becomes. For John Ramsey, the question was never really about those missing hours on December 26, 1996. The question was about how much of his private grief he was willing to expose to public scrutiny and judgment. For 28 years, he chose to protect that privacy at enormous cost to his reputation and his peace of mind. Now, at 80, he's chosen to finally share the truth about those moments in his daughter's bedroom, not because it changes the investigation, but because after nearly 3 decades of accusations, perhaps he simply needs the world to know that sometimes a father's tears in his daughter's empty room are exactly what they appear to be: pure, devastating grief. The screen fades slowly. A quiet room, a child's bedroom, softly lit, stuffed animals on a shelf, drawings on the walls, a bed neatly made with a pillow that still holds the faintest impression of where a small head once rested. The room is empty now, has been empty for nearly 30 years, but the memories it holds, the grief it witnessed, the silence it kept, those remain. They will always remain. For as long as there are questions about what happened in that house on Christmas night 1996, there will be a room that holds answers no investigation will ever fully uncover. A room where a father sat alone, holding his daughter's favorite toy, crying tears the world was never meant to see. If this case made you think about the lasting impact of unsolved crimes on families, the dangers of rushing to judgment without sufficient evidence, the importance of following scientific evidence even when it contradicts popular belief, and the very human cost of being accused without being charged or convicted, then subscribe to Crime Uncovered. Because here we examine these cases not just for their mystery and intrigue, but for what they reveal about justice, investigation, and the complex reality of truth. Hit that like button if you believe JonBenet Ramsey deserves justice. And drop a comment. Do you believe John Ramsey's explanation for those 28 years of silence? Because here at Crime Uncovered, we don't just tell stories. We examine the evidence, we follow the science, and we believe that truth, no matter how long it takes, deserves to be heard.